From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm the program specialist in the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please put them to silent or to silent vibrate or turn them off, perhaps. I'll also take a moment to make you aware that this program is being webcast by the library for future broadcast on the library's website and on the Kluge Center homepage. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. We offer opportunities for senior scholars, post and pre-doctoral fellows to do research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, and we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes a lifetime achievement in the fields of humanistic and social sciences. So, if you want more information about the Kluge Center, or you want to learn about future programs, I invite you to sign up for our RSS email list right here in the front or via the website, and look at our website as well for future opportunities for research. Today's lecture is titled, "No Evil Shall Escape My Sight, Fredric Wertham and the Anti-Comics Crusade." Our speaker is Chris Bishop, who is now concluding his tenure here as a Kluge Fellow at the John W. Kluge Center. As I was thinking about this morning, I said this topic feels particularly relevant. I was watching the news last weekend, and they said that the film Superman recently grossed $125 million in its opening weekend at the box office. It also had a note in that article that Iron Man 3 has raked in over $400 million at the box office this year. It's only 17 films in history have done this, and 5 of them are comic book character films. So it seems appropriate to ask if this pervasiveness and this penetration of these narratives and characters into the world's collective eyesight is having an impact. And this afternoon, our scholar, Chris Bishop, will offer his unique insights into these questions. Chris teaches at the Australian National University in Canberra. After almost 20 years consulting for the Australian government, Chris returned to university to complete a doctoral thesis on 10th century Western Saxon poetry. He has published widely on medieval society, and his most recent book was a series of essays exploring the transmission and reception history of medieval literature. He is presently undertaking a fellowship with the Kluge Center to complete a book for the University of Mississippi Press entitled Medievalism and the Modern Comic Book, which explores the ways in which the key concepts of medieval history pass into popular culture by way of comics. So this talk is one aspect of that transmission history, the critique of comics by Fredric Wertham and his role in the congressional inquiry into the comic book industry in 1954. So, without further ado, please welcome Chris Bishop.
Thank you, Jason. So, I'm an Australian, so I have to rock this Australian style. First thing I have to do as a representative of my government is do something you always do in Australia, and that's to acknowledge country. So I would like to acknowledge, first of all, the Nunotchkunk people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, and also to the Pescatawe people, who inherit both the songlines and the land rights of the Nunotchkunk. I will try and keep my accent as neutral as possible, but if I get excited, I'll speak fast, and I'll start to drawl as well. You can ask questions later like, what were you saying? But we'll see how we go. I'm also used to running around while I lecture. Usually I like to jog around the room because I get excited. So I'm going to have to stay here in order to keep in camera shots. So you'll see me anchoring myself to the lectern like this, except it's actually moving a little bit. So we'll see how we go with that. Now, I have other people to thank as well. First of all, I would like to thank the Kluge Centre itself, which has been incredibly generous. And obviously Travis and Jason and Mary Lou, Carolyn have been incredibly helpful for me while I've been here. But also too, I'm amazed at just the generosity of it. I think those of you who are American in this room can be well pleased with your generosity. I'm a foreign scholar and yet I'm paid to be here. I'm allowed to look at an amazing collection and work with it, which also brings me to thanking all the wonderful folks in the periodicals room where I get to read my comics. Up until now, I've been working with medieval manuscripts, you know, and I don't know if you've done much work with medieval manuscripts. When you work with medieval manuscripts, you go into a closed room and you sit down, and usually they're behind a sort of a perspex reader. And sometimes you're allowed to turn the leaves with a stick, but usually you're not. Usually you have to ask, and someone comes over and turns the leaves for you. But here, I've been allowed to sit down at a desk and handle these comics myself and read them, which is amazing. Amazing too when you consider that some of the comics I'm reading are worth a lot more than medieval manuscripts that I work with, which is an interesting thing in itself. So thank you very much for your generosity in having me here. Now, what I'm going to talk about today isn't really central to what I'm writing at the moment, but I thought it'd be more of a crowd pleaser because everyone likes to talk about Fredric Wertham and everyone likes to talk about the comic books crusade of the 50s. And I want to have a bit of a different look at it. A lot of comic book writing at the moment, the academic stuff, tends to it's internally consistent. It looks at comic books within the realm of comic books, but often it doesn't look beyond that into a bigger picture thing. And I want to look at Wertham and the 1954 committee hearing of juvenile delinquency in a bigger perspective. And then I want to actually look at Wertham too as a psychoanalyst and have a look at some of his things. That's what I'm going to talk about today. And I also picked it because it's just fun. So I'm going to have a bit of fun, hopefully. So let's have a bit of a talk about Wertham himself. I guess it's okay to call him Wertham. He was born Fredric Wertham in Munich in 1895. He, as a young man, became acquainted with Freud and conversed with him. And of course, you have his collection here again in the library too. After he died, his letters and all this sort of stuff comes here. You have his letters to Freud actually in this library as well, which I've only just started working with. As a young man, he immigrated to America, and he was involved, first of all, he comes into the public, I guess, consciousness in a small way in 1934 when he's involved as an expert witness in a murder trial. Now, have a think about this situation. This is 1930s. Nowadays, because Freudian psychoanalysis is so much part of the way we operate, so much part of our psychological landscape, it's hard to remember back to the situation when it was really, really new. And even in 1934, America, this stuff was relatively new. You're going from a legal system at this stage, which is really about right and wrong. And did they know what they're doing, and can we therefore judge them? And psychoanalysis is bringing this other idea that people could still be legally sane, but still have these other factors. Now, this is stuff that we take for granted now. We say, oh, well, look, there are all sorts of, if you were abused as a child, if you were the victim of violence as a child, if you were the victim of discrimination, or if you didn't have the same, chances growing up, of course that's going to affect the way you see the world. We take that for granted now. But think about 1930s. This was when this stuff was just new. And Wertham was there, bringing this into the American psyche. So he's used in 1934 as an expert witness in a murder trial, and that's an important point we're going to come back to later. And the thing we're going to focus on today is mainly his Operation 1954 and the United States Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency. And about the same time too, he published a book, Seduction of the Innocent, which has come in for a lot of criticism, and I'm sure there'll be people wanting to talk about that afterwards as well, in which he branded television a school for violence and comics as a source of delinquent behaviour. And this also dovetailed at the same time with a particularly critical incident in American consciousness, the Brooklyn thrill killer case of 1954. And I'm going to come back to all that stuff as we go through. So that's part of the context I want to talk about. Wertham himself, because now of the power of Jason was just telling you how powerful comic books are as part of the economy, of driving, not only comic book sales now, but also movie sales and merchandise sales and all these sorts of things. Because of that, and because of the position that Wertham is placed in as being sort of the anti-comics guy, you tend to get a lot of bad press about him. And a lot of things are forgotten. Here's some pictures of him working in clinics. He donated a lot of his time to working with kids in the inner city at the time. But largely what he's remembered for is his anti-comics stance, which is not necessarily, it's not a subtle interpretation of what he was saying. Against him, of course, is the comics book industry, and I want to introduce a few characters here. We're going to have a play, so we need some characters to talk about. I want to talk about these two stand-up lads here, Harry Donenfeld and Jack Liebowitz. They're going to be central to what we talk about as well. In 1935, these two guys bought National Allied Publications, which included Detective Comics. Here they are, enjoying their success. And these guys, of course, go on to start Action Comics. And we all know Action Comics, or we should all know Action Comics, because here, of course, is issue number 1 with Superman throwing a car around. Donenfeld, this fella here, famously bought the rights to Superman for $130 off the creator. Good investment, as it turns out. And this will be part of the whole, comics book legends as to how Schuster and Siegel eventually got some of the money back from this sort of thing. But that's Donenfeld, so I want to talk about that. Here's also a picture here, some other players. We've got Max Gaines sitting over here. And he's talking to William Marston there, a few other players there, Peter and Sheldon Meyer. And you can actually see that Marston's showing him a mock-up there of Wonder Woman, which we're going to talk about as well, of course, as well. So, in 1938, Gaines, who had previously been publishing like Bible comics and this sort of stuff, got together Donenfeld and Liebowitz, and they start All American Publications, which eventually will become DC Comics, which is a pretty big part of the comics book industry. So they're the other guys. So, why all the fuss? Why in 1954 was there even a committee hearing into this? And why did, as a consequence, the draconian comics book authority code was brought in place? Why, as a consequence of all of this, did the British government ban certain comics? Why were there comic burnings across the country? What's the whole fuss about? Let's have a think about. Well, I'll give you a quick smattering of how, if you don't know of Wertham, if you don't know where he fits in, I'll give you a quick smattering of some sort of the reports we have, or what commentators say. Howard Post, McCarthy was a maniac, he did nothing but harm, but Wertham was no better. And Wertham was no better. We've also got Bradford Wright, who describes him as the leading muckraker in the crusade against the comic book industry. David Hedges' 10-Cent Plague, which came out relatively recently, describes him as susceptible to illogic conjecture, peculiar leaps of reasoning, inclined to extravagant, attention-grabbing pontification. And the British commentator, Martin Baker, sums up by saying, he was a bit of an idiot. So, this is the sort of stuff, once you start to delve into this, once you start to read about Wertham, you're going to come across all this sort of stuff. That's what people are going to be saying about him. If you're a new player on the field, you're going to say, well, why is everyone so against this guy? Okay? Let's have a think about him. I also want to put one more player on the board, and this is Senator Estes Kefauver. So? Kefauver. Yes. So, Kefauver. I've only ever seen his name written, so I was hoping that someone would teach me how to pronounce it. Yeah, okay, Kefauver. So even in Australian it's going to sound different. But anyway, we'll go with this guy, who was one of the unluckiest politicians of all time because of just chance of birth. You'd probably know a lot more about him if he was born at a different time. He had a lot to do with all sorts of senatorial committees. He was a big player, but unfortunately he played at the time when other people were. He was a Democrat. He went for. He could have been the president, except that he had a very unfortunate time to be running. His initial play for politics, he ended up going against Dwight D. Eisenhower. So that wasn't so good for him. Eisenhower romped it in, he didn't get in. He later went for presidential nomination again after that, and unfortunately he was going against Jack Kennedy then. So unfortunately for this fellow, he happened to be picking his time into politics poorly. So, He's the guy we're talking about. Now, one of the things too that's going to happen, and this happens when you talk about 1950s history, especially in America, I find everyone's going to start to conflate all these sorts of things. Once we start talking about any of these sorts of committees, we're going to talk about McCarthy, right? And so everyone's always thinking about McCarthy and all that sort of stuff. And you see it up there with posts talking about McCarthy and linking the two things together. It's important to understand, of course, the Kefauver's committee wasn't part of the McCarthy thing, even though we tend to conflate these things together. Neither was the House Un-American Committee. That wasn't part of that as well. These things are all separate, but at the same time. So, that's what we're talking about. Let's have a bit of talk about that and some more. Let's go back to look at these plays. Now, Kefauver comes in and he wants to, according to the comics industry, he wants to shut comics down. And that's the way he's seen. But you've got to look at a bigger picture. Who are these guys? Here's a picture of Gaines with Donenfeld and Leibovitz soon after Leibovitz and Donenfeld bought out his publication company. Now, Max Gaines, fair enough, he made comics. He had educational comics and Bible comics and all this sort of stuff. And a small printing company, and he produced those. Why were Donenfeld and Leibovitz into it? Well, now, of course, you look back and go, well, obviously, because you're going to make millions and millions of dollars from comics. But no one at the time knew that. So what were these guys doing? What was Leibovitz? You have to understand what Leibovitz actually was. He wasn't that interested in comics. Leibovitz was an accountant for the mob. And that's why he wanted comics. Why did he want comics? Because what you've got is these products which go out and sell for a certain amount of money. How many comics are we selling? I don't know. Maybe we sold a quadrillion. I don't know. It's a great way to launder money. What you've got to understand is Leibovitz actually has one. He's an accountant. He only has one client. He's an accountant with one client, which is the mob. So what he's interested in doing is getting himself into some sort of industry where accountability is difficult to understand, where we can basically be selling massive amounts of units, but we don't necessarily have to justify where they went to. And that way, who's to know if we're selling 1,000, 10,000, 1 million? That could explain where we got all our money from. That's his interest in it. What about Donenfeld? What's his interest? Well, he has a job as well. He's not just interested in comics. What does he do? He makes porn! So straight away, and this isn't Gaines' fault. Gaines is getting better into bed with these mobsters. And what they're looking for is two things. Firstly, a way to launder money for the mob. Secondly, from Donenfeld's point of view, he wants access to a printing press. Now, everybody knows what he's doing. So when the police come into Little Italy to raid him, you go, oh, no, comics. That's what I'm doing. I don't make porn. So what he wants is a front for his porn industry, and that's what they're looking for. So they buy up a smaller comic industry and get in there. Now, what you've got to understand about Kefauver, of course, is in the early 50s, his big interest is in stopping the mob. His initial congressional committees are about mob action. So he only follows the comics books trail because it's an adjunct to what he's doing for the mob. And he brings Wertham in on this. So even if they are fudging some of their stuff, you've got to think about a bigger picture here. They're trying to stop organised crime in the 50s. So let's have a talk about these. Donenfeld himself was a self-confessed mobster. He referred to himself as a gangster. He liked to live the high life. And he was well acquainted with this fella here, Frank Costello, Francesco Castiglia. Have you ever come across this guy before? You know this guy? He was the big guy in the 50s, Frank Costello. Here he is, forgetting things in front of the senatorial committee. That was his big thing. A lot of other people just pled the fifth and didn't go, but Franco would show up and could not remember. Okay, that was his big thing. I was saying on the last panel, there's a classic joke kicking around with comedians in the 50s, Franco Costello comes home, his wife said, "Hey honey, how was your day?" "I cannot remember." "What'd you get up to today?" "It eludes me at this moment." So, here he is going, I do not understand this question. Now, if the voice I'm putting on sounds familiar, it's because later, all this stuff is on record, right? So later, when Marlon Brando is deciding how is he going to do Vito Corleone in The Godfather, what does a mobster sound like? He goes back to the congressional recordings and he listens to Franco Costello giving his testimony. And then he bases himself on that. So, here's Frank. At this stage, Frank is the head of the Luciano family. He meets Lucky Luciano as a young man, so he's the head of the Luciano family. And I could also talk about the Gambinos. The Gambinos they had their own comics industry going on with their own pornography as well. And Kefauver will get them as well. But that's what he's after, so you've got to keep these things in mind. So there he is. His main interest is in stopping the mob. And of course, at the congressional hearing too, it has to be said, there's Max Gaines dies. This is Max Gaines' son, Bill Gaines. Bill Gaines takes over the company. And he, in fact, is one of the few comics book representatives to show up to the congressional meetings in 1954 and talk in their defence, which he does appallingly badly. To be fair to the man, he was a Dexedrine addict. So on the day of imagine this. You're showing up to the congressional hearings, you're there to plead for your life. What do? Take lots of Dexedrine. He drinks lots of coffee, takes lots of Dexedrine, walks around for a while, starts to lose his edge, so he takes more Dexedrine. So by the time he gets there, he's barely sensible. Dexedrine, of course, for those of you, why would you know? It's an amphetamine. If you know Dexy's Midnight Runners from the 80s, the pop band, you'll know that they're running not because they just love jogging. So this is the situation. This is the situation we're talking about. So that's part of it. So the other thing about Wertham, of course, is that, okay, so some people will say, okay, yeah, some of those crime magazines, they're pretty off colour, but, you can't equate superheroes with this sort of stuff. Famously, Wertham says that Batman, of course, is homoerotic, that Superman is a violent narcissist, and that Wonder Woman is a lesbian sadomasochist. That's his professional psychoanalytic view of these comics. And the great thing is now, of course, we look back and go, how foolish can you be? There's no homoeroticism in Batman. There's no violent narcissism in Superman. And Wonder Woman is lovely. So none of these things can possibly be true. And these are things like, so let's have a bit of a talk about that, because I'm not too sure that Wertham, as a psychoanalyst, was actually too far from the mark. You have to read Seduction of the Innocent too in a psychoanalytic mode, and you have to read it quite subtly, because there's a lot of stuff going on there. But let's have a bit of a talk about this. Let's start by talking about Batman. It's important to understand what Wertham actually says about Batman. He says that Batman adventures are like a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. He's very clear to point out, okay, that, because the big, look, just Google this, get onto a chat room. Is Batman gay? There's tons of stuff there. Wertham's not actually saying Batman's gay, to be fair. He's saying that Robin wants to enter into a pedophilic relationship, to be absolutely clear about this. And he uses, of course, this wonderful, you can imagine a 1930s psychoanalyst uses lovely classical terms here. So he talks about this Ganymede-Zeus relationship they have going on. Okay, so that's specifically what he's talking about as it being pedophilic. And he talks about some of the young men that he's seeing. Now, you have to understand too, and this is something which we find abhorrent now. Wertham is working in clinics, and these clinics, part of the work he's doing is trying to re-educate gay men into being straight. And this is part of 1950s, a psychoanalytical process in the West. And obviously we find that stuff abhorrent now, but this is what he's working with. And he talks about some of these clients that he's seeing, and his idea is that it doesn't really matter what the intention of the person writing the comic is. He's talking about the young men he sees, and they read into this. I mean, imagine yourself being a gay man in 1950s America, or a gay young man. You'd be looking for things to bolster what you know is natural about yourself. And of course, you want to read literature which helps you understand this sort of stuff. So he's saying that this sort of literature will allow you to do that. And he talks about, his clients there. One of his clients is saying, who says that I found my liking, my sexual desires in comic books. I think I put myself in the position of Robin. I did want to have relations with Batman. You can almost connect yourself with the people. I was put in the position of the rescued rather than the rescue. I felt I'd like to be loved by someone like Batman or Superman. So, is it possible to read any sort of gay connotations in Batman? Everyone goes, no, we can't see anything homoerotic about that. I give you Pink Batman. Now, those of you comics fans will be able to pick out some criticisms here, but I just love this picture. I just wanted to put this one up here. Everyone will say, by the way, that you're misreading this, because what's actually happening here is that it's a red Batman, but the comic process wasn't very good, and the red went fugitive. So it was originally meant to be a red Batman. You would have to ask, though, wouldn't you, why Robin's jacket didn't go fugitive. He's still wearing a red jacket. Of course, at the end of this one, of course, we get to the finale, Batman's best, most flamboyant outfit, which is his rainbow outfit. If you want to know why Batman gets to this position, basically his young ward here, Dick Grayson, has broken his arm in an athletic competition. And he has to go to a hospital and he gets his arm put in a cast. Now Robin can't show up to any of Batman's adventures because everyone will go, hang on, Dick Grayson broke his arm, Robin's got a broken arm, and of course Batman's secret identity will be given away. So in order to take people's minds off that, Batman comes up with the idea of a series of fabulous costumes. Everyone will be so interested in the fact that his costume keeps changing that they won't ask about Dick's broken arm. So, there you go. Finishes up with this wonderful rainbow suit. Now, obviously, I suppose we can say, well, the rainbow means something more today than it did back then, but I just think it's a fabulous costume. And I'm always interested in ellipsis, aren't you? You know, these things in comics, what was this man about to say? Something. I like to think he was about to say, I love you, Batman. Batman, he's not ready to hear that in the 1950s, and so he reacts in a violent, homophobic way. All right, well, let's just talk about standard life in America in the 1950s. I'm a young gay man reading these sorts of things. Is there anything I could possibly see as being homoerotic in these things? I don't know. How about this one? It's a routine morning. It's a routine morning? What, they wake up in the same bed? I don't know. Is that like routine for 1950s? Yeah, and this isn't his son even. This is his ward. So yeah, that was a good sleep. Come on, Dick. A cold shower and a big breakfast. And then down to the Batcave to repair the Batmobile. I'm way ahead of you. He doesn't actually have his own room. He's sleeping with Bruce at this stage. How about this? When they're not actually sleeping together, they're also getting a tan together. They work out in the gym a lot together. And let's face it, it's like, we don't have to be embarrassed about our bodies. Get the kid off and, it's okay. I think you can understand why it is that young men accessing this material could want to project into this. It's pretty easy to. And that's what Wertham's saying. He's saying if you want to, you can project into this sort of stuff. I love this one. How about this? You've got your evil mastermind here telling all these guys, that he's just passed on this infection to them. And anyone that they've touched, of course, is also going to be infected. You've got the Atom going, Jean Loring, I've signed her death warrant. Flash, I gave Iris West a kiss of death. Green Lantern, Carol Ferris in deadly danger. What's Batman saying? Robin, what have I done to you? What indeed, Batman? What indeed? If you wanted to read this stuff, it's there. It's not hard to find. And once the subcommittee came out, then everybody was pretty aware of what was going on, and they took steps to try and redress it. There's a big step. Julie Schwartz, the guy who was coordinating the Batman comics at the time, talked to his writers and tried to basically get the homosexuality out of Batman. So there's a big step then to make it as straight as possible. What makes it straight? Well, a dog for some reason. Give them a dog. They'll see more family that way. And so we get the invention of Ace, the Bat Hound. So he comes in first of all, and there he is, Ace the Bat Hound. That's really not straight enough. It's just a dog. Come on, let's get some women in there. What do we need? We need to get Bruce a girlfriend. And that's where Batwoman comes in. Now Bruce has got a girlfriend. She realises, of course, there's no chance with those two, so she just lavishes her attention on the only straight character there, the dog. And so they go even further than that by giving Robin a girlfriend as well, and he gets Batgirl. And then they kill off the butler. They don't even like having the butler there. That's a bit too gay for us. So the butler gets killed. Oh, Alfred the butler dies. Okay? So, and Aunt Harriet comes in to look after them instead, because that makes more sense. So, what happens? They straighten up Batman, and sales plummet. Everyone stops buying Batman. That's an interesting thing in itself. By the early 60s, they're thinking, actually, let's cancel Batman, because no one's reading it anymore. But it gets saved. How does it get saved? Do you know how it gets saved? Most people's access to Batman. Yeah, television. That's right. We get the 1960 television series. Now, Burt Ward wrote an autobiography, Boy Wonder, My Life in Tights. If you have a read of that, he's pretty open about the whole camp nature of the thing and the whole fact that you can, we were playing on that. Everybody realised that basically Batman was selling really good when you could read homoeroticism into it. Once you got rid of the homoeroticism, people stopped buying it. So let's bring back the homoeroticism as well. He says the heavy use of double entendre made that interpretation, in fact, persuasive. It was also brought in too, you had Hugh Hefner got involved. You might not be aware of Hugh Hefner's involvement with all sort of stuff, but he probably also resurrected a bit as well. There was a series done in the 1940s, one in 42 and another one in 49, of the original Batman. So the old series that used to run before movies, the old serial type things, and that was produced back then. Hefner, or he says he came up with this idea himself, but he probably didn't. Basically, Columbia Pictures got those old serials together, tacked them all together into a 3-hour, no, it was more than 3 hours. It's 200 and... Oh, my maths. See, that's why I do arts. 5 hours. Tacked them together into a 5-hour film and put it out there. And it was going well on the college circuit. So people would hire this thing and have parties while the old Batman series was running behind it. Hefner got wind of it, thought it was a great idea, had it at the Playboy Mansion. Having a party at the Playboy Mansion, goofing it up, everyone dressing up, inviting all his mates over. And one of them, of course, is William Dozier, who's working for the TV station, which decides to put this on and said, yeah, we can do that, but it's got to be campy, it's got to be fun. So Hugh Hefner is also involved. And actually another interesting character involved with this sort of stuff too is because they were looking for some sort of pop culture reference, and they wanted to go to some pop culture guys and say, let's make this all poppy. So who would you go to in the 60s if you wanted to talk about pop culture? Of course you would go to Andy Warhol. And there's Andy Warhol as Robin, with Nico. As in fact, like everyone says, who's the best Batman? In my book, it's got to be Nico. Let's face it. So, in fact, when the TV series premiered, they had a big screen premiere downtown New York for it. Andy and Nico showed up for it. So, it was pretty obvious what was going on. In the 1980s, Frank Miller was asked to reboot the whole Batman franchise. I should say too, with the comics, they decided, to get rid of all that sort of stuff. They got rid of Batgirl, they got rid of Batwoman, they got rid of Bat-Hound even, unfortunately. And Alfred came back from the dead. Comics, fantastic. It all got a little bit tired. They wanted to reboot it in the mid-80s, and they bring Frank Miller in, of course. And Frank Miller, we can argue about this later as well, but Frank Miller, of course, is a terrible homophobe. And he didn't want to do Batman because of the whole nature of that relationship, which he found distasteful. But he was allowed to change the gender of Robin, so it seemed a bit better. For some reason, it was okay that Bruce Wayne would be living with an underage girl. So, Robin becomes a girl in his version of it. And who becomes gay? The Joker becomes gay. Evil, gay Joker. So, Frank Miller's reinterpretation of it. We should also probably put in Joel Schumacher as well. You will have seen, hopefully, these two movies. Joel Schumacher, openly gay man. When he wanted to do this, you remember the first couple of Batman movies coming out, there's no Robin. It's the elephant in the room. Where's Robin? Oh, come on, man, that's difficult. Joel comes on and he wants to bring it in. He makes Robin older, of course, so it's not a pedophilic relationship, and it's an openly gay film. And according to both Joel Schumacher and... who was the Batman in the second one? George Clooney? He said, that's what killed the franchise. George Clooney said, I played it gay, and that's what killed it. So, Batman. Let's talk about Superman. I want to move on and talk about Superman, that violent narcissist. Superman conceit is what Wertham talks about. This sort of disregard for democratic processes combined with an idealisation of the vigilante. He said this had done the most harm to the ethical development of young people. He said it was impossible to separate the word Superman from the Übermensch of Nietzsche and ultimately Hitler. Which is, it's interesting actually. Have you noticed the way we don't use Superman in that term anymore? Like when people talk about Nietzsche now, they talk about Übermann. They just use that word, not Superman. Which is an interesting thing in itself because we've changed that. It was, who was it? It was George Bernard Shaw, wasn't it? 1903, he produced a play, Man and Superman. And he popularised the idea of translating this German term into Superman. But then after Superman became popular, we didn't feel comfortable about that anymore. Wertham never felt comfortable about this idea. He said, can't you see what's going on? It's very clear what's going on here. Okay? Superman himself is a symbol of violent race superiority. And of course, he famously says, Superman with a big S on his uniform. We should, I suppose, be thankful it's not an SS, he says. And there's Superman looking very unhappy about all this. Well, what could be more American Superman? Well, as it turns out, those of you who do follow Superman will realise that he's recently turned in his American citizenship. Unhappy with politics in this country, he's decided to become a citizen of the world. But he's done other things in alternate universes as well. You may remember him as a Soviet Superman. And you may also remember him as, in fact, a Nazi Superman as well, where he does have the SS on his chest, but the SS has turned into a swastika. Yes, there are some pretty nasty things happening in the world of comics, which I guess goes back to what I was saying about Wertham, the way he sees these things. Superman, in fact, starts off in 1933. Schuster and Siegel start, the first version of Superman is here, the reign of Superman, where he's, in fact, a Nietzschean arch-villain. And you'll see here he looks a lot more like Lex Luthor than he does like the later Superman. They reworked him a few times, and they changed him for his final... even after he gets released in Action Comics in 1937, he still continues to change, but he doesn't look like that anymore. They based this picture on a particular stereotype at the time. If you know movies of the period, Erich von Stroheim, who plays the archetypal evil German, with the monocle and the shaven head and the fiendish cackling laugh, that's who they're basing that on. So you can see that when Wertham is saying, well, come on, he's actually got some stuff to be working on there. There's Joe Shuster himself, drawing. Is a creation of Siegel and Schuster. There's a famous story, of course, Mitchell Siegel, Jerry's father, being killed in a robbery, and people like to make a lot about the nature then of him drawing this bulletproof man, this man who can't be destroyed by bullets. But to be fair, he actually had the Superman on paper 3 years before that happened. And Wertham in Seduction of the Innocent talks about how these would-be Supermen compensate for some kind of inferiority. And he also notes a general powerlessness of these people, like Siegel and Schuster, to control their own product in their careers. Remember, these guys have just sold the rights to Superman for $130 to the mob. And Wertham's talking about that as well. That comes out in articles you read too, like newspaper articles. There's an article in Coronet magazine, 1946. Superman is a byproduct of the frustrated boyhood of two undersized Cleveland youths. Okay, so it's very clear to these people. While high school students, the duo absorbed beatings from neighbourhood toughs. Jerry Siegel eventually married Jolyn Kovacs. She changed her name to Joe Carter. You'll see everybody changed their name back then because you didn't want to be Jewish in 1930s America. You changed your name. Jolyn Kovacs was actually a model, and she came in to model for Lois Lane. And Siegel married her. She actually dated Schuster first. And yeah, how bad is that? He took her to this big comic writers ball and introduced her to Siegel, and just a few months later, Siegel married her. And in fact, poor old Joe Schuster was 60 before he eventually got married. And that marriage only lasted a couple of months. He married a Las Vegas showgirl, Judy Calpini, and their marriage only lasted a couple of months, but most of his life he lived with his mum. So, there's this little quip when you read Seduction of the Innocent. There's this little quip in there about Nietzsche and do you go to women, go not without a whip. It's very interesting. The first chapter of Seduction of the Innocent was the last one that was written, and it's basically coming out while all this stuff is going on. And so it's a little quip there about something, and we know what Wertham was talking about now. We know what he's saying, but he can't actually come out and say it because he would have gotten in a lot of trouble at the time. He knows that Schuster is not just doing comics. Remember I told you about Donenfeld and his porn industry? Of course, he's also doing porn. Now, we all know that, but we can't say that in the public forum. We can say it now, of course, it's so much on. So what he's talking about specifically here is Knights of Horror, which is one of the journals which Schuster was drawing for. So porn was drawn as well as photos. A lot more drawn porn came out at this stage. He's also working on Hollywood detective Rod Rule Continental magazine. So, if you're reading Superman, you're reading about all your characters, Superman, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Lucy Lane, Lex Luthor. But if you get to read Knights of Horror, you see them in a sort of slightly different situations. So, you'll all recognise Lex Luthor, there he is, although you might not have seen him doing quite this sort of stuff before. You'll recognise, of course, Superman and Lois Lane, although you might not have realised this aspect of their relationship. Schuster was pretty good though, like everyone got to go, so they got to swap over as well. You'll probably remember Jimmy Olsen and Lucy Lane. Lucy Lane is Lois Lane's younger sister. Here they are, and I can tell you that ain't tobacco they're smoking. And if you found out that one of your friends had led your little sister astray, you would also want to punish them. There's Lois Lane punishing young Jimmy. So this is the sort of stuff that Schuster is drawing, and Wertham knows that, and he makes this little veiled reference in his book to that sort of stuff. This stuff, of course, is all involved very much with the thrill killers case, the Brooklyn thrill killers case at the time. 1954, in the middle of all this committee meeting, this is going on as well. You got 4 Jewish neo-Nazis. Just let that sink in. Jewish neo-Nazis in Brooklyn. Going on a rampage. The ringleader is this fella here, Jack Coslow. That's Mel Mittman, Bob Trachtenberg, and Jerome Livin. And this is the body of the man that they've killed. Basically, these guys, for a few months, went through parks torturing and killing homeless people. No motivation at all. They would set them on fire, they would beat them, they dragged this man 7 blocks before they threw him in the river and he drowned. And so you can imagine the impact this had. And what's interesting is Wertham in the middle of this is brought in to judge whether these boys, because they're all, the oldest one at this stage is 18, but down to 15. He's brought in to judge whether they're actually criminally liable for their actions. Are they insane? They seem to have no moral compass whatsoever. They do it because it's just a thrill. They just want to kill people. They want to see people hurt. And so Wertham's brought in to judge whether they're sane or not. And interestingly, Jack Coslow here, who grows a Hitler moustache for the trial, says, he gets most of his ideas from comic books, in fact. He doesn't know who Wertham is. But he says, there's this thing going on at the moment with this trial. He said, if that crazy shrink could get a hold of me, the things I could tell him. It turns out that, in fact, some of the equipment they've used, like a bullwhip and a cape, that they've actually bought through the comics that they're reading. They've actually bought them through the mail order section there. So this is all... So not only do you have the mob involved with this, you've got these young blokes who are actually saying, yes, this is what we're doing. I'm running out of time, so I better run through a few things. I do want to talk about Wonder Woman's lesbian sadomasochism before I finish. So I'll just run through that fairly quickly. Wertham, of course, said the homosexual connotation of the Wonder Woman type story is psychologically unmistakable. Unmistakable to him. He can certainly read this as a lesbian sadomasochist. Everyone's going, what? Are you crazy? Wonder Woman, of course, was originally scripted by William Moulton Marsden, who was a Harvard-trained psychologist. We're in print from 1941. And he said he wanted to create a feminine character, all the strength of a Superman, plus the allure of a good and beautiful woman. So his idea was to have this Amazon princess. And I showed you this picture before of him talking with Max Gaines about the initial proofs. There he is there. Interesting couple of things you need to know about Wonder Woman, of course. She has the golden lasso. Marston will spend most of his life trying to impress upon people that he, in fact, invents the systolic blood pressure test, okay, where you tie small wires to people's fingers and then you can tell whether they're lying or not. Okay, and you see that his small brass wires become the magical golden lasso here, because when Wonder Woman puts a golden lasso around people, of course they can't but tell the truth. And also, too, she has the bracelets of power, which deflect bullets, but when chained together, will turn her into a helpless and submissive woman. And the bracelets, I'll just keep moving on. So, Wonder Woman has this unmistakable quality to it, according to Wertham. Let's look at this. William Marston was living with 2 women at the time, Elizabeth, Sadie, and Olive Byrne. They lived in an open and polyamorous relationship. This is late 1940s America, and this is what they're doing. I think this is amazing. Sadie and William had a son, Pete, and a daughter, Olive, and Olive and William had two sons, Bern and Don. And in fact, when William died of skin cancer in 1947, Sadie and Olive continued cohabiting and did so until Olive's death in the 1980s. Marston said basically he had based the temperament of Wonder Woman on one of his lovers, Sadie, but the physical appearance on the much younger one, Olive, who had actually been one of his psychology students at Tufts University. And in fact, used to wear these bracelets, which he got the idea for the bracelets of power from. So, Marston also didn't believe in things like love. He actually believed that there are elementary unit responses. We only have elementary unit responses, mainly dominance, compliance, submission, and inducement. And he wanted to write a comic book so that he could get that across to young people so that they would understand the folly of love and the importance of dominance. So in fact, he knew exactly what he was doing. And Wertham was right in ascribing this to him. There's also all sorts of other stuff there. A lot of this stuff gets, you'll know that Wonder Woman is helped by the Holiday Girls. Names change, so you sort of lose slang. Holiday Girls is 1930s, 1940s slang for gay. So it's very clear to Marston what he's writing about. A holiday boy is a gay man, a holiday girl is a lesbian. So he has the holiday girls there. But as slang changes, people lose track of this. And you can see here, Wonder Woman bringing around one of her arch enemies. I'm no longer jealous of Wonder Woman. I don't hate pretty girls. One final thing, we've got some correspondence between Max Gain and Doc Marston, he used to call him, from 1943, because people are writing into these comics as well. And there's a famous letter, which you can read over at the Smithsonian, where one guy writes to them, I'm one of those men who derive an extreme erotic pleasure from the mere thought of a beautiful girl chained or bound or masked, or wearing extreme high heels or high-lace boots. In fact, any sort of constriction or strain whatsoever. And Gaines writes back to Marston saying, this is one of the things I've been worried about. You know, like, we all know what we're doing, but can you make it less obvious? And in fact, they agree, and I was saying this in the panel before, they agree to reduce bondage in the comic by 50 to 75%. I don't know what that means. Like, you know, do you count up all the panels and you go, let's cut out one panel out of every, or two panels out of every, or three panels out, or do you just have less chains? Or anyway, they decide, let's do this. Without actually interfering with the excitement of the story, though. Like, we all know what's going on. And so I think that's an important thing to think about with all this sort of stuff. Wertham knows what's going on. There's a lot of things which can't be said about in the public sphere because it's 1954, but you need to contextualise it within a greater legal context of the mob and a greater sociological context of the other stuff that was written by these sorts of people. And I reckon I might finish up there and we can have some questions. James.
Wortham was the sole psychiatric consultant to keep all his 1952 hearings on organized crime. And so that brings that whole relationship very clearly into play. And you know, Wortham, Kefauver used to, ironically, go to Wortham and think he wasn't being bugged. And it was Wortham's fault. Very interesting. Probably will be bugged, but he thought that.
It's interesting. And Frank Costello, actually, if you're a fan of The Sopranos, Frank Costello also sought psychiatric counselling because he didn't feel happy being a mob boss. And so he spent a lot of time on the couch as well, not with Wertham, admittedly.
But Costello also viewed himself as the modern face of the mob
Yeah.
in the 50s. And he was playing to the image. He was trying to do a PR thing for the mob. And he lived a high life. And he lived very exuberantly and openly as the mob was.
That's right, and he took out a suite at the Waldorf Astoria and lived in there. But he still liked to grow tomatoes as well. Thanks, James. Any questions? Mary Lou.
Chris, I happen to know you're a medievalist. And I'm wondering if, when you look back at medieval tales, you find some of these same themes emerging at a perhaps subliminal level.
Which tales are we talking about? Sorry.
Well, that would be for you to define.
So Mary Lou's asking, do we find in early literature, say medieval literature, And you could even take it back further to classical literature. Do we find the same themes emerging? And I think obviously we do. But then, having said that, that could also be about my perspective. I quite like the stuff I read about Freud. Not all of it, obviously, but I quite like that stuff. And I quite like the stuff I read about Jung. And both of them based a lot of their early work on the idea that there is a metatext running through world literature, that there are these basic concepts which we keep coming back to time and time again. And so the reality is that for me, I do find those themes in earlier literature, whether it's 19th century literature or medieval literature or classical literature. And of course in the West all those things are based one upon the other. But then it could just be that I'm looking for them anyway, so I just find those things. Like the young men reading Batman, I look for and find what I want to find. Yes?
Have you had a chance to take a look at any of the reissues that are coming out of these, the reboots, the new versions of all of these characters? Are you seeing some of the same issues kind of being addressed or not addressed in these new reboots, retellings, money-making schemes that the comic book industry is?
No, good question. So the question is, do we see these same things being addressed in reboots? It's a typical part of the comic industry that we reboot things and we change them slightly. And so the question is, do we see these same themes being addressed? And at the moment, we are seeing a lot of issues about gender and sexuality being readdressed. And what tends to happen is people go back and reimagine and rewrite things and say, oh, we always knew this about this character, but now we can be open about it. But then at the same time, too, there's resistances. And one of the reason you end up with this debate about Batman's sexuality is this continued resistance on the part of a big part of the community to acknowledge possible alternate readings of Batman. So in fact, 60 years on, we're still having a lot of the same debates. We do have some openly gay comic characters now, but not that many. And they're still controversial.
Do you think some of those themes that have been discussed in the 50s have now moved to discussions regarding the creators of comics? The way we examine Batman in the 50s and deconstruct those comics, looking at them, now we look at Frank Miller and discuss him as a person, and we discuss sort of gender and different voices in the creators of comics.
Yeah, great. So the question there is, when we discuss these issues now, do we tend to define them in terms of the creator? So we look at the person who creates the comic and say, well, that's his agenda or that's her agenda. And that's what's going on there. And that's a really good, and Adam, of course, knows the answer, but it's absolutely true. We know a lot more about someone like Frank Miller. Having said that, people have gone back to guys like Bob Kane and asked him, did you draw a gay Batman? And Bob Kane said, he's definitely not gay. They've gone back to every single person who ever drew. There's no one who's ever drawn a gay Batman, according to all the people who have ever drawn or written Batman. But to be fair, Frank Miller also says that he's not homophobic. So if you've read any, so Frank Miller's 300. Okay, so if you've read any Frank Miller, you'd realise that Frank's struggling. Oh, I'm probably going to get sued now, aren't I? All right. Yes.
I'm really interested in this connection to Warhol. Is there more to? What was the connection there? You just mentioned it briefly.
There's too much to talk about. There's too many tangential bits. The question is, what's the link there with Warhol? What's happening with Warhol? And it's amazing. Warhol does his own Batman film before everybody else. He loves Batman. He decides to launch a Batman. He thinks what would make Batman better is Dracula. So his version is actually Batman Dracula is his film. We don't know if it means like a Bat Dracula or Batman versus Dracula. And he films at the top of his warehouse with all his guys. And of course the soundtrack, killer soundtrack, Velvet Underground does the soundtrack to this movie. What a great movie, except of course it's Andy Warhol, so it's incredibly boring. 27 minutes of a brick. And then Dracula comes out and Batman's doing this and back to the brick. But yeah, he seems to be very involved, and he seems to be, because he's the pop icon. And so it seems to be that both guys like William Dozier, Julie Schwartz, and Hugh Hefner are coming to him and getting ideas, and Warhol is just coming up with these crazy ideas and then going off with these other projects. But on the opening of the big gala opening, he does show up in that costume with Nico as Batman, which is pushing some boundaries anyway. So yeah, he did his own film, and I'm sure you can probably download bits of it on the internet now. James.
I have another question along the lines of Nietzsche. Wertham was born in the late 19th century from a assimilated, middle-class Jewish family. He goes to London, he studies at King's College, he's interned. He becomes part of George Bernard Shaw's political movement, very much supporter. One of the reasons he talks about leaving Germany and Würzburg was of anti-Semitism, even though he was a non-practicing Jew, married to Hester later. But she's active, they're very active in the anti-fascist movement. And his wife Esther is a sculptor, she does the death mask for Ernst Stoller, the great expressionist playwright who had to leave and then committed suicide in New York. So there's a lot of seeing this German. There were also allegations that some of his publications were burned by the Nazis in 1933. So Wertham grows up seeing that Nietzschean influence. So to me, that's almost second nature to him. And this comment here, no evil shall escape my sight, reminds me of Antisthenes, the student of Socrates, who said to Sappho, "Uden Zen," to the wise, nothing is foreign. And I think that's the kind of mindset that Wertham has. Do you agree with that?
The question is, do I agree with James? And the answer is yes. Yes, I do. James knows a lot more about Fredric Wertham than I do. But to all of that, the contextualisation of Wertham as a product of the Weimar Republic and of German intelligentsia and of all that sort of thing, to that, there's so much you can add about where he's coming from. I think it's interesting though. At the same time, the Nazis hate Superman as well, and that's because they see it as a product of Jews. Because Schuster and Siegel are Jewish, and so they see it as a product. So you've actually got, if you read Wehrmacht propaganda, there's like weekly magazines that go up to the Wehrmacht. And if you read those, they'll talk about this decadent Jewish art, and it's lovely to read because they're saying, that's the decadent Jewish American way, to have vigilantes and just pure force, whereas over here in Germany it's all about reason and logic and philosophy and culture. But Jews don't understand that, and so they deride Superman as well, which I think it's an interesting thing as well.
Relationship with Wertham too. He was part of that circle. But there are letters between them in New York. So he's part of that Frankfurt School mindset. And so that all fits into seeing, I think, this supporting your idea.
Oh yeah, and also there's this wonderful crucible of New York City, isn't there, where all these people are immigrating to. One final thing to point out, because these things get very divided along terms of ethnicity. I think it's really interesting to remember too that the mob is very Jewish at this stage as well. And people forget this because it becomes a Sicilian thing. And obviously you've got Cassilia there, and he's Sicilian. But don't forget, Cassilia himself is married to a Jewish woman of German descent, and half of his enforcers are German Jews who've come to America. So in fact, this thing it's an amazing, and it's also too, the printing presses get set up into Little Italy because basically the mob is so strong that the police can't come in there and find out what's going on. So it's an amazing crucible of New York City and what New York City produces.
And with that, great comment about my hometown. We'll have to conclude it there. Chris can stick around for a few minutes to take questions, but thank you all again so much for coming. Thank you again our scholar, Chris Bishop. And if you want to learn about more events that we have here at the Kluge Center, please sign up on our RSS list or check out our website, loc.gov/Kluge. Thanks so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.